All right. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. This is Jisun Jung from the University of Hong Kong, and then we have a very big, exciting book talk today. My colleagues, three of my colleagues, who just published the book, very important book about gender and education in Central Asia. I know many of audiences in this room are always interested in doing research about gender, especially we don't know much about Central Asia context. So I really believe this will be a good opportunity for us to learn and discuss something about gender issues in Central Asian education. We have three editors of the book. It's a great pleasure to host these three distinguished professors. Professor Aliya Kuzhabekova from University of Calgary in Canada, and Professor Naureen Durrani from University of Nazarbayev, and also Professor Zumrad Kataeva from the same university. So without further ado, I want to hand over to three editors, and then please feel free to introduce your book, and then we will receive questions from the audience after 45 minutes of the presentation. Thank you. Hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jason, and all the audience for being here with us for the launch. Can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Not yet. It's been a while. I stopped using
Zoom.
Yes, absolutely. Zumrad, would it be possible to share? Because when
you may click the green button called share.
it is asking me for a password. So it's saying it may not be possible. Zumrad, will it be possible?
I'm trying to open your slides, Naureen. I can share, I think. Let me do that now. So
In the meantime, while Zumrad tries to open the PowerPoint, I just want to acknowledge our funder. Thanks to generous funding from the Peer Network, which in turn has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, United Kingdom. This book is freely available for download. And thanks, Zumrad. You can move to the next slide. Just to give you the structure of the presentation, I'll begin with introducing the book, talking about the rationale, why this book was needed and who is it for, and just introduce some chapters that might be of interest to this particular audience with interest in higher education. Following that, Zumrad will share findings from 2 of the chapters, which focus exclusively on higher education. And in the end, Aliya would share another chapter, key findings from women in leadership in education in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and then will give some concluding remarks about gender in education and how we might go about researching this topic in the future. Next, please. So just about the context, as we all know, gender and education are very contextually shaped issues, and therefore this context is quite unique. It is important also to say that this is our first attempt to bring a dedicated volume on the topic in Central Asia. Largely, we are talking about, although definitions might vary, we are focusing on the 5 post-Soviet Central Asian countries. Zumrad, if you can go back to that slide. Thank you very much. So these are the previous slide, yeah. These are all newer nations gaining independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. And therefore, they start with some strong similarities in terms of access to education, in terms of gender equality policies, in terms of employment opportunities. They are also predominantly Muslim countries, although within secular constitution, multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies, and as Soviet legacy, access to education and employment opportunities at the start were quite equitably distributed. They also differ in their post-Soviet trajectories, but also pre-Soviet histories in terms of their gender norms, in terms of adherence to Islamic or cultural laws, but also during the Soviet Union, gender, as we know, in most colonizing societies, gender is the battleground for establishing legitimacy over the natives. And this was also the case in the Soviet Union. So during that history, some nations like Uzbekistan, they were at the forefront of resisting the gender equality policies, less so in some other contexts. By contrast, some other Soviet policies were more readily resisted in Kazakhstan or other nomadic societies compared to established societies like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Post-independence, economic and political ideologies and levels of fragilities have also had an impact on gender agenda and education agenda. Before, the Soviet Union kind of played an equalizing force. So even if some republics were poorer, still they had the same level of access to education. But after the Soviet Union, Tajikistan went into a civil war. There have been level of conflicts on and off in other countries as well. So all these have an impact on gender and education. Next, please. Why it is timely is because recently there were 2 large bibliometric studies carried out. This one is on educational research, and what we see is on the whole this post-Soviet context contributing very little on an international scale, but within that context, Central Asia playing a very marginal role in the construction of knowledge, although things are rapidly changing within the last 5 years. Next, please. So same, a couple of years ago, Zumrad led on a paper, a bibliometric paper that mapped the literature on gender studies in post-Soviet countries. And again, very marginal contribution of these countries to global literature. But again, we see very marginal contribution from the 5 Central Asian countries. And as you can see, both in educational research and in gender studies within Central Asia, the contribution is very unevenly distributed. Kazakhstan is contributing far more compared to Turkmenistan with just one paper. So this is also reflected in the book, the extent to which we cover the 5 different nations of Central Asia, because we have to work with existing pool of researchers. Thank you. Next, please. So what makes this book unique and who is it for? First of all, it's quite unfortunate that since independence, all these countries are producing knowledge based on their country without actually collaborating with researchers from other neighboring countries. This was timely that we did a comparative analysis of gender equality and education across all 5 Central Asian countries. We use a very interdisciplinary approach, drawing both on education and gender studies literature. Most importantly, again, there are literature reviews which mention that often Central Asia is looked or explored by researchers who are mostly affiliated with Northern institutions. Here, predominantly, those who have contributed are either from Central Asia or have very long-standing relationship with Central Asia. So this book was an opportunity to nurture local talent and amplify their voice as well. All chapters offer actionable insights for policymakers and practitioners, both from education and development. We also offer, an overview. So we look at micro level studies, but we also look at the bigger picture in terms of statistical trends and policy analysis. And we argue that there is some global relevance beyond Central Asia. Central Asia is quite at a unique position. It shares a lot of similarities with the global north in terms of its gender equality indicators, how accessible, and I will come to those issues later. The accessibility of education, the presence of women in higher education, employment rates, etc. But at the same time, all these countries are newer nations and are emerging from a different form of colonialism than Western colonialism. But many would argue that some of those processes had similarities in terms of dominance and whose culture values become dominant. And therefore, as newer nations, we know that gender, again, is very central to the construction of nation building and national identity. And it can pull and push in different directions that my colleagues will share later. Thank you. Next, please. So in terms of the policy context, we see gender equality is enshrined in all the constitutions of the 5 countries. There is a renewed policy focus on gender equity in education. However, gender policies are often, they overlap with family policies, where within the role of motherhood and family. So this kind of further entrench the symbolic links between gender and national identity and nation building. So recently, many scholars, this is about, again, the legacies with the Soviet Union, where Candioti produced a very seminal paper displaying how the Soviet policies were both modernizing and colonizing. This Soviet paradox where women were emancipated, they had access to education and could access the labor market, but within unchanged family dynamics or the gender power relations. So this legacy also continues post-independence. The responsibility of keeping traditions and traditional values rests on the shoulder of women who embody the very fabric of ethnic identity. The upbringing of child is again the responsibility of mothers, making sure that they are imbued with the national values, but also to counter both Western and Islamic influences on national identity. And one can argue that at times these discourses can be very paternalistic as well. Next, please, Zumrad. So just some glimpses of how Women's Day was celebrated in the past. This image on the left, you can contrast it with the celebration of the women. So the ideal form of womanhood have varied considerably. Next, please. This is just pictures of Tajikistan's government giving instructions of what women at different ages in different sectors are allowed to wear as a legitimate dress code. So again, a very strong association between gender and national identity in Tajikistan. Next, please. Looking at broader statistics, one legacy of the Soviet Union is that, you know, when we compare gender equality indicators in the global perspective, the region as a whole is doing quite well, although there are variations across the different countries. You know, if we compare it with global trends, the region as a whole is doing better in terms of gender equality in education, although Kazakhstan is doing better than others. Can you please move to the next one? Again, like the global north, women compared to men are in higher number enrolling in higher education institutions, although you see a variation across where Tajikistan is particularly not doing as well as other countries. Next, please. Again, this is like a longitudinal data. You can see all of a sudden Uzbekistan is showing a very steep progress in terms of access to education for women. And this is in the last couple of years with the change of political leadership and more emphasis on gender equality. Next, please. So tertiary completion rates again vary across the countries, with the best indicators there in Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan will close the gap in due course, hopefully, with these new measures introduced by the government. Next, please, Zumrad. However, although women are in greater number accessing higher education, they are concentrated in specific disciplines, primarily in the healthcare and in education. And again, this is a continuity of the Soviet legacy. However, compared to the Soviet times, the proportion of women studying hardcore STEM disciplines, particularly engineering and computer science, have dipped down, and we see a very gendered pattern in what women are studying and what men are studying. Next, please. This is the proportion of STEM graduates in Kyrgyzstan, where we see a recession in the number of STEM graduates. So again, not a very positive development. Next, please, Zumrad. This is about female researchers as a share of total researchers by field. So of course, when women enter into certain disciplines, that also then result in female researchers being concentrated in specific areas, although overall, compared to global statistics, the region as a whole has a very good number of female researchers. There are specific disciplines where there is an underrepresentation of women. Next, please. Aliya will talk more about leadership in relation to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, but although these statistics might look depressing, still globally, Kazakhstan has done far more than making sure that women are represented in top leadership in higher education. Next, please. And this one is about the political representation of women in parliaments. Here is one area where the region needs to do more. And again, you will see Uzbekistan a steep jump in improvement, and that's because of more affirmative policies in Uzbekistan introduced recently. Next, please. So just a word about the book structure. Following the introduction chapter, we have two chapters where we analyze the region as a whole, first in terms of policy and then in terms of statistics. Then the rest of the three chapters are not on higher education or a mixture of different levels. Next, please. We have three chapters exclusively focusing on higher education, and these are the chapters that we will be introducing today, and Aliya will then close the presentation with some concluding reflections and discussing ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naureen. Let me share my screen. As Naureen said, I'm gonna talk about two chapters that solely focus on higher education, and one chapter would be from my own chapter and on gender quotas in Tajikistan, and the next chapter will be on doctoral student mothers in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, authored by our emerging scholar, Almira Tabayeva, with Naureen. They both authored this paper, and I hope I can make justice to both chapters in this presentation. So let me try to open my, to share my screen now. Stop. Do you all see my screen? Okay, thank you very much. So the chapter I will be talking on gender inequality in higher education in Tajikistan, exploring barriers and affirmative actions. So the purpose of the study was kind of to map the present situation with the experiences of women in higher education institution. Unfortunately, as Naureen talked, and our bibliometric study showed, empirical research focusing on Tajikistan is very limited. So my chapter is based on policy documents, international reports, media sources, and I was able to interview one alumni of gender quota programs that I will be talking about, but that is a limitation. So, but I have decided to include that interview because it offered very rich data and deep source of to hear about experiences of that gender quota and affirmative action taken by the government in Tajikistan. So I will not much stop on this slide, but as Naureen said, Tajikistan experienced a civil war right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union from 1992 to 1997. This is one of the smallest countries in Central Asia. Borders, the longest border is with Afghanistan. And then Uzbekistan and China and Kyrgyzstan. So it's very much a landlocked country and small. So this civil war particularly affected the gender relationship and position of women in Tajikistan, which probably all the statistical data shows that Tajikistan is behind all other counterparts in Central Asia. So, after that, the civil war unemployment rate has severely increased. Nowadays, men migrate as labor migrants to Russia mostly, and women are joining nowadays as well. And the remittances of the labor migrants constitute around half of the gross domestic products in Tajikistan. Well, after the independence, Tajikistan is a signatory of all international convention on gender equality, sustainable development goals set up, and it has adopted many strategies and policies to ensure equal participation of women and men in the labor market and education and health and policies. However, despite all this implementing these gender equality policies, Tajikistan still ranks on lowest in Central Asia on gender gap index. And women in Tajikistan continue to face numerous challenges. There is a high domestic violence, early marriage pressures, limited economic opportunities for students, and worse access to economic resources. And there is a very much retraditionalization of gender relationship and emergence of patriarchal traditions after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. A significant gender gap is evident in Tajikistan's youth unemployment, with a difference of nearly 42% in NEET indicators. Women are much behind than male counterparts, and on less than 40% of female students nowadays enrolled in higher education institutions, and importantly, only 7% of female students are studying STEM disciplines. So to address this pressing gender inequality in higher education and demands of local and international actors working on gender inequality, the government introduced the so-called presidential quota or gender quota that addressed this issue by admitting women, girls from rural areas without entrance examination to the higher education institutions. However, the quota again predominantly directed women towards feminine professions like medicines or education teaching, and not much in science, technology, and engineering and mathematics. So much of the literature and supported by the interview of alumni challenges in the implementation of the quota program relate to overall economic, cultural, and structural and political context in Tajikistan, because while government tried to commit some financial resources to the to provide girls to study in higher education institution. Unfortunately, the stipend and the was very small, that again the burden of the financial situation were laid on the families which are living mostly in rural areas, and their social economic status is very low. So, and it was supported by the interview, and the alumni said that the monthly stipend that equaled my weekly spending, living on the budget, student life, and after that kind of public transportation was not available, she couldn't commute to the university to the studies. So she had lots of financial burdens on that. Again, cultural and religious influences often intersects with financial struggles. Again, in Tajikistan, as in mostly women are forced to get married early, to become mothers of the children, and the kind of education is not very much important for women, and all the financial kind of commitments when limited financial resources that are available to families are given to sons, because there is a kind of cultural perceptions that women get married, but son will stay with the family and provide for parents in the future. So the interviewee said is that in her own small town, finishing secondary school for a girl was an achievement in itself. Their neighbors pull out school after finishing her elementary education because her parents were worried about the status of her, and she got married at the age of 17. Also the barriers, it's low preparedness of students, because the girls who were admitted without without entrance to, examination to higher education institution often was unprepared to study in universities, and they really struggled to continue to study, and the statistics shows that some of them dropped of the university because of their low preparedness. Well, despite of this, economic, cultural, religious challenges, the particular interviewee was very happy with her experience, and she was saying that even the program offered some extracurricular activities on women and gender equality, and she kind of said that I always thought as a woman I am not enough, but nowadays I kind of realize that my tradition did not respect me because I was a woman. So, and she was confident that parents would not find money for me to go to college. I was lucky. Therefore, the presidential quota available for me, and she would be happy if this affirmative action will continue in Tajikistan. Well, in the conclusion, despite all the efforts, Tajikistan made progress in gender equality. If in the first years of independence, the number of higher education students, female students, were very low, around 20%. Now it's around 40%, doubled. They made secondary education, 12 years education is mandatory. However, in terms of leadership, most of the faculty members are women in Tajikistan, but only one woman holds the position of rector of president in the university. And some of the women who are at the leadership positions, like vice rectors, deans, they are mostly hold the position of, there is a position of a woman or vice rectors for moral upbringing. They called it vaspitание or tarbiya, to emphasize kind of motherhood of the woman, and but genuine kind of position of in a woman in leadership that could hold some power within the higher education institutions are very limited. We kind of challenges indicate that we need in Tajikistan close collaboration of ministry, departments, schools to challenge the entrenched gender norms and stereotypes, just increasing the number of women or and not support them in a different various issues is questionable. This questions the implementation of gender quota in Tajikistan. So yes, that was some of the concluding thoughts. And of course, gender mainstreaming policies need to be reconsidered and reinvigorated in Tajikistan. All right, and second chapter that I will be talking about, and Naureen is here. Naureen, if I miss something, please jump in. So Almira and Naureen looked at the experiences of doctoral student mother, and she compared the study of doctoral student in Kazakhstan and another Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, right? So the authors actually also talked about the existing gap in knowledge, because most of the studies on doctoral student mother are mostly coming from Western perspective, and this chapter looks at the particularly at the experiences of Central Asian doctoral student mothers. So both these countries took distinct paths in developing doctoral educational programs after the independence. Kazakhstan massification and privatization resulted in higher female representation in doctoral programs, while Uzbekistan is behind because the policy of the first president, Islam Karimov, was on strict restriction on access to higher education overall. However, after coming another president elected, there are still a low representation in doctoral student, despite of the increase of the participants. So Almira interviewed I think 15 participants, and from different disciplines, from social science, and they were aged between 30 and 37, having children 1 to 3, and they were at various stages of their doctoral education. So she interviewed, so she used two theories, Butler theories, Henri theories. So complexities of balancing their roles as mothers, wives, and Kelly's daughter-in-laws did barriers into their completion, their doctoral student. She's they're writing that resulted in a feeling guilt among doctoral students that they couldn't be a good moms, and it affected their children, and how it is very tough to have to balance the role of mother and being woman and children, and particularly daughter-in-law, Kelin, which is in Central Asia very important. You know, it's usually women daughter-in-laws have to serve husband's family, parents, take care of household, and it's very difficult for them to focus on their doctoral studies. So one of the interview says that my husband doesn't understand that research requires times. He insists on me smiling in front of his parents, and even I'm feeling moody or tired. I'm expected always to be prepared to serve and study only at night when everyone is asleep. So gender-based barriers, again, it reflected in academia as well, not only in the domestic sphere. They were saying that women doctoral students are not taken seriously by academia. They or if you go to do your data collection, they are not taking you seriously because you are a female researcher. You have to come with a man who has a power of or an official power that had or paper from above. So also supervisors' expectation and practices were also the barriers, challenges they were talking about, that supervisors insist that they finish their studies on time, and sometimes supervisors require full commitment to the studies, and this is very challenging for them. Institutional support, also they are struggling financially. Institutions are not providing enough support for doctoral student mothers. And of course, they are experiencing stress, and at the same time, support they're getting from the families, from spouses, and also the peer support is advancing, or that the doctoral studies in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So in the end, the authors conclude that intersection of gender education and societal expectation affect their academic pursuit. Social expectation of women's caregiving responsibilities was evident in both countries. There are financial challenges, and Kelin being a daughter-in-law is very particular findings in both these countries. And while in Kazakhstan, doctoral student mothers faced reduced productivity and recognition due to time and mobility constraints. In Kazakhstan, local customs require doctoral students to have a male escort in the research field, limiting their autonomy and recognition as scholars. Well, thank you.
Okay, so nice to see everybody. We are transitioning to a third study in the field of higher education, which will focus on women in leadership positions in universities in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And then I will provide some concluding thoughts about our paper. So this study was this chapter was based on an earlier study that I conducted together with Aynur Almuhambetova, who was one of the students and then postdoctoral fellows at Nazarbayev University, one of the actually leading researchers on gender and higher education in Kazakhstan. Oops, trying to see, okay, just a second. In this chapter, we focus on the following policy problems. So in general, if you saw the statistics from Naureen, in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are actually doing really well in terms of attracting women to academia. So in Kazakhstan in particular, in some fields, women actually surpass males as faculty members. And in both countries, there are more women in PhD education than males. But despite that, the representation of women in higher educational leadership in the region, in the overall Central Asian region, varies from just 5% of the total in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan to 26% in Kazakhstan. And on the global scale, that's still not a sufficient representation. The research gap then is that most of the current research on women leaders in Central Asia is at nascent stages. So this region is also ignored in global research in higher education. The topic of women leadership is marginalized in general, even in global research. And then existing global knowledge on women leadership tends to be based on empirical data from the West. And that necessitates looking at other regions of the world, and Central Asia, as Naureen mentioned, represents a very interesting case because of the combination of post-Soviet, Western, and traditional dynamics in the country. And so it may actually offer some interesting insights from their theoretical standpoint. So the research questions that we asked in this study were mostly what are the experiences of women leaders in higher education in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and how do the countries compare in terms of the experiences of the female leaders. And we focus mostly on the factors that affect the advancement of women towards leadership positions. And the significance of the study is that it of course could inform university human resource practices focused on attraction, retention, and advancement of women, also on gender-related policies in higher education. But as I mentioned, the study of this issue in Central Asia may also offer some important global, insights for global research. So the review of the literature showed that there are a number of theories that are currently used in the study of women leadership, and they could be summarized in the following way. So one important theory is human capital theory. So many studies are saying that if women don't have sufficient skills and knowledge, and if they have pauses related to maternity leaves or some barriers to advancement in the early childbearing age of their career, they just do not accumulate enough knowledge and skills to compete successfully with males. Then there is also psychosocial theory, which ultimately explains how societal gender role expectations and norms affect women's beliefs about themselves. So most of the studies reveal that the gender norms lower the level of confidence of women. So many women just don't have sufficient level of confidence and motivation or internal locus of control to believe that they can become leaders. There's also gender organization theory, which talks about the fact that most of the organizations in contemporary world are designed with a male in mind. So promotion structures or leadership advancement structures, evaluation structures, they're all designed for a male, not for a woman. Then there's also gender professionalization theory, which comes from higher education field, which talks about the fact that academia itself is also designed for a man. So, for example, tenure processes in Western countries, again, evaluation systems, they are all designed pretty much for a white male in mind, and they do not account for the breaks and challenges that a woman may face if she takes breaks for taking care of children, for maternity leaves. There's also performative leadership theory, which argues that women frequently engage in constant reenactment of gender role expectations. And this, on the one hand, maintains the existing gender order, but it also changes the structures and gender expectations. And finally, intersectionality theory, which says that social experiences are shaped not only by gender, but a complex interaction of gender with other social structures, such as race, religious background, social income, and etc., socioeconomic background, and etc. So with these theories in mind, we actually engaged in phenomenological case study, where the central phenomenon is the experiences of women leaders in Central Asia, conducted 30 in-depth Zoom interviews, like 50 women leaders from Kazakhstan, 15 from Kyrgyzstan, using maximal ration sampling and varying women by age, marital and parental status, ethnicity, type of institutional ownership, geographic location of the participants, level of leadership occupied, disciplinary affiliation, and leadership and higher education experience. So now, in terms of results, there were, of course, lots of parallels with global research on women leaders in higher education. So, for example, one of the typical type of human capital theory was not as relevant within Central Asian context because, as Naureen has already explained, as a legacy of the Soviet Union, the educational system is relatively developed, and women actually have, especially in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, have good access to higher education and to advanced higher education. And there are relatively good maternity policies which allow women to take breaks. Many women, in fact, the reason why there are so many women in doctoral education in these two countries is because many women try to build their human capital when they take maternity leaves and they pursue PhD education when they are at the childbearing age. Other theories were very relevant. So in terms of psychosocial theory, what we found is many of our participants actually, although they were leaders, they never aspired to become leaders. They were pushed by those who are at the top to assume leadership positions. And those who were leaders didn't want to really to get promoted. So in addition to that, many women found it difficult to combine their family and professional responsibilities, and many lived with a permanent sense of guilt, because there is a societal pressure that they have to take care of their children or elderly, but as they commit to this leadership career, it's very difficult to balance these two roles. And so psychosocially, the effect is that many of them live with the perpetual feeling of guilt that they don't fulfill any of their roles successfully. Then, of course, gendered organization theory suggests, is also relevant because the promotion structure at universities is designed again around males. Many participants mentioned that opportunities are mostly available for women who either are too young and are not planning to get, are not at the age when the society expects them to get married and to have children, or vice versa. Women are promoted when they already finished with childbearing and their children are at the age of high school or beyond, and they don't need to really engage with children as much. In fact, some of the participants mentioned that during the young women mentioned that they would be straightforwardly asked during interviews whether they are planning to get married, and if they responded that they had plans, then the employers would assume that they will most likely have children and will have to take maternity leaves, and they will never be even hired, to say nothing about being promoted. In addition to that, because women do not comply with the societal masculine ideal of leadership, many of them feel that they have to work harder in order to prove that they are qualified. And this also affects their expectations from other women. So women tend to have high expectations toward the women, especially if they are in the top leadership positions where they have to compete with males and they have to sustain the image of highly successful leaders, and then they become extremely demanding. Due to deficit of males in female-dominated fields, very often women assume mothering approach, which is actually cited in some other studies in other countries. So because there is a general belief that males are better qualified for leadership positions, if there is any male in the collective, women would typically assume that he is better qualified, and they will even perform some of his responsibilities to relieve him of his duties and to, allowing him to flourish. So this happens in in the school context a lot, where males are very underrepresented, but even in higher education context, like we had very interesting themes in the interview that they would say, we carry our males in our hands or on our shoulders because there are just so few of them. Also, women were undervalued as compared to men in peer and performance evaluations, and lots of women participants, not only male participants, believed that women in general lack strategic thinking and the ability to think globally. There is this stereotype that they are much better, they are focused, they are detail-oriented, they are very responsible, but that doesn't qualify them for leadership roles, because a leader should be a strategic thinker, visionary, and should be able to think globally. And even women believe in this. Women also have difficulty gaining access to informal decision-making. So lots of decisions, and that's reported in many Western studies too. Many important decisions are made in informal settings, in smoking rooms, in bars after work hours, and women do not have access. It's just against the gender norms for them to join male company in the bars or to smoke together with them in the smoke rooms. And as a result, they don't have access to all of the decisions and all of the information that affects the opportunities for promotion to leadership positions. Then academic profession itself is also gendered. So there's an interesting thing happening in Central Asia. In the Soviet Union, very often males would dominate in STEM fields, women would dominate in social sciences. And there is this idea that to become a rector, you actually have to come from STEM fields because they have higher values. And because women mostly work in social sciences, they cannot advance anywhere higher than vice rector for academic affairs. Also, being vice rector of academic affairs is, sorry, is associated with more caring roles and with responsibility and performing lots of academic bureaucratic work. So it's believed to be more appropriate for women. Performativity theory was also relevant. So Naureen explained that in our societies, there is a interesting mix of 3 different sets of gender role expectations. Some come from the traditional norms, pre-Russia colonial norms. There's also Soviet norms, which essentially expect that a woman should work, but at the same time take care of children and family. And neoliberal Western norms, which believe that women should participate in the labor force on the same competitive basis as males. And as a result, women have to engage in this complex game of juggling these contradicting expectations. And, for example, if she faces, I can tell you my own personal story. So if I go to the Ministry of Education or Ministry of Science and Education to defend my funded project from the government, and most of the people in the committee are older generation folks from regular universities, like local, so they are older in age, those usually have very patriarchal gender norm expectations from me. So I have to be very submissive, and I act like a Kellyan because I need to recognize that these are older guys and I have to speak to them in a particular way. But then, because I worked in the Western style institutions and most of my colleagues were white males, I really act like a Wonder Woman. I could be, rigid feminist, and I could speak up and I could do whatever I wanted. Whereas when I interact with older females who come from the Soviet background, sometimes I have to act like this Soviet mom. I need to recognize that I have a family, I have to take care of my children, and etc. So you have to know which audience to play what kind of personality, and that's the performativity here. But on the other hand, what performativity allows you to do, it actually allows you to bend the norms, because there's no clarity about which set of norms are at play, and that empowers women to actually modify norms to push the boundaries. And intersectionality, of course, was also relevant. For example, the way gender expectations are experienced by ethnic Kazakh and Kyrgyz women is very different from the way they're experienced by Russians and Koreans, because they're like patriarchal norms operate differently. And also there, as you probably understood, there's a difference between generations. So those, if you come from the generation of Soviet people, you would act and you would believe in a little bit different set of norms than younger generation who are influenced a lot by the Western norms. And finally, the novelty of our study was that there was one theory which is not discussed in research on women leadership, but we brought from other research on Central Asia, and that's relevance of institutional theory, in particular, the role of informal networks. And the reason why we understood this is because there were at least 2 examples when informal networks really were at play. In Kazakhstan, for example, we found that one of the reasons why women cannot advance to rector positions is because there's such a phenomenon as team leadership. So rectors used to be, at the time when we conducted the study, they used to be appointed at the level of the ministry. And when a rector is appointed, he brings his team of other males that he puts into the top positions at the university. And so the only position that's not touched is the position of the vice rector for academic affairs, because that person has to understand how the university really works. And that's usually a female that stays there. But the team, it comes and goes. And usually rector positions are used as an elevator to advance to top positions in the government. So this is a trial ground where the rector will come, he will be tested by the government, and then he can be promoted to the ministerial chair position. And as a result, this team is a mobile team. So it moves from one assignment to another. And it assumes that you have to be, first of all, politically minded, also ready for geographic relocation, and ready for corruption, because much corruption happens at that level too. And women in general are very risk averse. So they kind of avoid joining the team because they don't want to engage in corruption. And second, they are not as flexible in terms of geographic relocation. They are dependent on their spouses. So this like that tells you that these informal political networks beyond the university and limited access of women to this political informal networks prevents them from advancing anywhere beyond vice rector for academic affairs. Another influence was that all of this informal matchmaking and games, they are very often negotiated and maintained via informal events. So they are maintained via gift giving. Guangxi in China, I guess, similar notion. So, and this gift giving, it happens during weddings or funerals, anniversaries, and other life events. And usually when you go to if you're married, you go to those events with your husband. And you have to give a very impressive gift in order to kind of build your alliances. The problem is that a male who controls the finances in the family, they can do that. But a female cannot do that. And it's kind of not appropriate. If the husband comes, then he's dependent of his wife. So it's not as easy for women to actually have access to these informal events and consequently to then the powerful informal networks. And so that was something that was not normally discussed in leadership, in like women leadership research, and that I think we brought with our study. And there were some differences between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Both are historical nomadic countries. So one of the reasons why you can see some of the indicators being higher in these 2 countries is because of the traditions within nomadism, where women actually are somewhat more freer and less dependent on patriarchal norms within nomadism. But in case of Kyrgyzstan, actually, in Kyrgyzstan, like when we ask women about their aspirations and their beliefs, whether they can advance to the position of a minister or the position of the president of the country, they were more optimistic about that. And the reasons for that were because historically, Kyrgyzstan actually has an important female figure. Like in the past, in Kyrgyzstan, there were some women leaders at the very top of the country. And also, they actually have a history of having a woman president. So, whereas in Kazakhstan, this never happened. And even like nowadays, it's like people have doubts whether a woman will ever become a president of Kazakhstan. And now I want to move to, like, that's the end of our chapter of our study, some basic conclusions and implications from our overall book. So there were some emerging themes across the countries. First of all, on the one hand, gender equality is now widely acknowledged as an important area of action by policymakers, and lots of important documents have been adopted, international commitments have been made. The difference is really in policy implementation and the level of funding that governments can commit to, pursuing all of those policies. Another emerging theme that was mentioned by Naureen and myself in my study is this complex interplay of different sets of norms. These influences complicate women's navigation of the gender roles, but they also empower women to play the sets against one another and to gradually push the boundaries and change the expectations. There is also complex interplay of colonial sets of norms, because we're coming out of post-Soviet colonialism, but we are getting into Western colonialism, neo-colonialism. And this displacement is accompanied by the appropriation of the self-ascribed modernizing role in the liberalization of the Central Asian women. So both discourses obscure local voices and initiatives, misrepresent some influences in the region, such as, for example, religion and tradition, and silence local players and activists in the development of gender policies. So they all assume that there's no agency and all of the agendas are driven by external players, whereas there's local agency too. And the studies also reveal the complex mechanisms by which gender norms are constructed and impact the educational choices and experiences of women. So the channels of influence include families and different players within families, extended family, like mothers-in-law, parents, peers, siblings, also educational organizations. These are promoted by teachers, by faculty, by peers, and also by educational materials which are used. Future employers and internship sites, supervisors and colleagues in case of women leaders, and society at large via social media and gossip. Then, as in the Soviet Union, the key rationale justifying women's participation in the labor force and their pursuit of education is economic. But within neoliberal capitalism, which has brought about significant socioeconomic differentiation and fierce competition, there's a push for families to consider women as serious economic players. And this push, what it does is that economic reasoning actually pushes some spouses and parents to accept the fact that wives and daughters should be enrolled in higher education because it increases economic competitiveness of the family and their influence in some cases if you become an attractive wife and you can bring the dowry to the family. And also assume some of the conventional women's roles in the family. So we increasingly see in younger generation that husbands may actually take the role of the caretaker if the woman is extremely successful and she wants to pursue leadership positions. Similar to other emerging nations, another characteristics of gender dynamics in Central Asian societies is the importance of women in the societal construction of national identity. So something that was discussed by Naureen. In terms of future research directions, so in general, there's the research on women in Central Asia and in education is very nascent, and more research is necessary. In the same way, more research is necessary on post-Soviet region on this topic. Most of the studies currently are of qualitative nature. Meanwhile, there is quantitative study are especially important because they will allow to lead to local theory building and testing. Most research is also informed by pragmatism and is descriptive, and there is a need in more critical approaches, especially decolonial perspectives would be extremely relevant, and they are actually picking up after the war of Russia and Ukraine. Most research is also informed by Western theories, and more local theoretical interpretations are necessary. Also, the current conceptualization of gender is limited to the man-women dichotomy, and there's not enough research on LGBTQ plus individuals' experiences. And finally, there is a growing number of capable local scholars, and it won't be appropriate if future studies conducted just by the foreign scholars. It's important to include all of these emerging local talent into future studies. So that's pretty much it about our book. So I hope there's enough time for you to ask questions.
All right, thank you so much. Well, I didn't realize the time because I was so fascinated by the stories and the topics and contents from the book. So many congratulations again for this important book. I think we have like 10 minutes and then we have like 4 to 5 very good questions, online. So to save the time, let's just go through all the questions, and then any of the editors can respond to questions. Is that okay for you? Instead of doing one by one, I think it's better to take all the questions at once, and then you can just pick up some questions that you would like to respond. Okay, can I invite Taylor? Would you like to speak, or do you want me to read the questions? Our first question is from Taylor.
Sorry that I'm not that convenient to speak. Do you mind speaking?
Sure, of course, sure.
Thanks.
So yeah, I will read it for Taylor. Thanks for the sharing. I'm surprising that rising education attainment and high participation rate among women in Central Asia. However, I'm wondering whether the absence of men in household, no matter from cognitive or level of work abroad maybe, would reinforce the traditional gender roles, even as the education level improves. If so, will the policy effort of sponsoring women with education opportunities be insufficient? That's her first question. Monique, would you like to speak? You also posted a good question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your wondering and the insightful sharing, because you mentioned the PhD mothers, doctoral mothers in your book. So I'm wondering something about the marriage. In these countries, women are traditionally expected to marry at a young age. So how does pursuing a PhD will influence their enter into the marriage? And conversely, how does marriage will affect their career promotion? Yes, that is because their women are underrepresented in higher education. There are many factors influencing this dynamic. So particularly, how about the factor of marriage? Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. Mario, you have a question?
Yeah. And thanks, Professor Jisun, and the professor who from the Central Asia for the sharing this the importance new books and the fascinating the research. So I really appreciate the opportunity to learn from your work. So and for the professor new Zumda, right?
Yes.
Sorry. So I think you have the very insightful the research on the gender equality in Tajikistan, the higher education system. So as your research point to the deeply the integrate the patriarchies, the norms, the key, the barrier. So what role do you see the higher education institutions playing activity, the shaping and the shifting these gender norms and beyond the just implementing the state policies? Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Can I invite Gloria? Gloria, can you speak, or do you want me to read the question?
Now, Professor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, professors. Interesting and very insight sharing, and congratulations again. I want to know how about the men in the Central Asian society? How do they think about those women just to face the different identity between the mothers, academic, and the doctor student? How do the men think about this situation and the difficult when the women face in the academic chief?
Thank you, Gloria. We have a last question from Gigi. I will read it for her. Thanks for your sharing. I have a general question about the book. If certain cultural stereotypes, like women should give a priority for family care, are deeply ingrained, how can really policy design avoid just these superficial compromises? That's her last question. Where I know we just bombed with a lot of questions to the three editors at the same time, but feel free to pick up any question, and if you want to respond, feel free to respond to any of the questions without particular order. I think that's better. Would you like to start, Naureen, or?
Yes, I can start maybe with Taylor's question about, is education sufficient for gender equality. And this is not just in the context of Central Asia, but based on my research in other contexts, as well as the literature, the knowledge of the field on the whole. Education is a necessary condition for gender equality, but in itself is not a sufficient condition. Education provides enormously the opportunities for women to become independent financially, and that gives them some kind of freedom in the choices that they make. But many times their choices are informed by familial norms, the expectations that society place on them. Also, the norms in the labor market that Aliya mentioned in terms of higher education and academia, but these gender norms exist in all kinds of occupations. Unfortunately, it's quite tempting for people to believe that education is a panacea of all of society's problems. But unless affirmative action in other spheres is carried out, it becomes increasingly difficult for the benefits of participation in higher education to have empowering role for women in different spheres of life. And I think the tying of women with the national identity becomes a very constraining offer. There are expectations of how many, when should they become a mother, how many children should they produce, who should they marry, who should they not marry, and things like that. So, action in all politics, economy, law, law enforcement, and importantly in family, like take the case of Bangladesh, where enormous progress has been made in terms of access to education, but that has not resulted into greater empowerment for women. And often as a teacher in the UK university where I'll get students from Bangladesh, they would say, the basic is the family, the constraints the family put on us. And related to that is marriage, yeah? That is again a very important role in Central Asia. Becoming married is a very important milestone, both for men and women, not just for women. Even though divorce rates are increasingly higher, becoming a parent is very important. I think in Central Asia, this becomes possible for people. In our university, I've never seen so many pregnant women or so many nursing women in higher education ever in my life, working in Pakistan and working in the UK, as I see in my own institution here in Kazakhstan. And it's predominantly supported by the mothers of the mother. So it is again very gendered in that sense. And mother, delaying marriage can become a penalty for women, because, as I said, getting married is a highly desirable identity position. And the more a woman becomes educated and successful, she becomes less desirable in the marriage market, unfortunately. Maybe my colleagues who have greater experiences on the ground, mine is more just talking to students and from the literature. But I'll leave the other questions for my colleagues so that all are covered.
Thank you, Naureen. Zumrad, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, maybe Mario's question about, particularly about Tajikistan, what role do you see higher education institution? Thank you very much, Mario. I think, as Naureen said, education is not like in a vacuum, right? And higher education institutions in the context, particularly in Tajikistan, are very much, the education system is very centralized there. So the power is coming from the top, and higher education institutions and leadership are implementers. You know, they don't have that much voice or power to change anything, including you know, gender issues. But there are I met lots of people, individuals, individual supervisors, individuals who are for particularly males who are for promoting gender equality initiatives in Tajikistan. And I think now they said the policies sometimes, the policies and the cultural traditions can be a barrier to implementation of policies. So I think this is again the societal expectation and societal pressure, and higher education institution leadership should work with, you know, local activists, local scholars, and on gender equality. And for example, a recent study not on Tajikistan but on Kazakhstan, on higher education leadership agency on mainstreaming gender equality, showed that even leaders, they entrench and reinforce patriarchal tradition and gender inequalities themselves. Even women, you know, they think that rector should be a man because, you know, he has more power, male have more progressive thinking and rational thinkers, and women are not like that. So even although they prioritize and acknowledge there are gender issues and the role of higher education institution, but at the same time it's kind of not priority. You know, we have another priorities in our work, and gender equality. And some of them were even questioning why you are asking about gender, because we have lots of women working in higher education institutions, and the academic profession itself is feminized, right? We have lots and lots of women, but you know, in the leadership there are, as Aliya's research showed, and our research showed, that there are not so many women. So yes, there are, I think policies are again not enough, and you know, in order to just ticking a box is not enough, and we have to, higher education institutions have to work with all non-governmental organizations, local activists, and themselves be an agent of gender equality initiatives. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Aliya? You are muted.
I'll probably pick up the last question that was just posted about the STEM pipeline, because there was one other study that we didn't discuss that was actually conducted by Noureen on this topic, who is one of the key experts on this particular topic in Central Asia. And we have conducted a couple of studies to explore the transition of women throughout the pipeline. So in Kazakhstan, interestingly, when girls, you know, if you look at the data from TIMSS and PISA, girls actually are doing much better than boys. So they have high scores in mathematics, in sciences, and at the time when they apply to universities, they're as qualified as boys. And families in general, most of the families are actually very supportive of girls. They provide lots of educational opportunities. They encourage them to study. So in early ages, in Kazakhstan, there's no really a differentiation in discourse in terms of expectations. In fact, many families invest lots of money in girls' education. But then when they decide on applying on STEM professions, what happens is that girls tend to be as successful as boys, not only in sciences, but also in social sciences. And some just choose not to go in STEM because they're successful in other fields. But another reason is that at the time of applying to universities, families start to differentiate. There are some who are keenly aware that there are few opportunities for women once they get this education, so they start to discourage girls to apply, whereas others, mostly like from engineering background, if there are males or females in the family who are from STEM background, they may actually continue to support girls to proceed to major in STEM fields. So then when they come to the university, they start to experience all sorts of gendered structures and norms and expectations. For example, we find that they are not always receiving the same educational opportunities in the classroom. You know, in teamwork, they can be degraded to minor roles, and they don't fully participate, and they don't learn to the same extent as boys. They may be also excluded in the lab. You know, and there are particular male interactions within the lab which prevent women from gaining the same opportunities or make them discouraged. Then when it comes to lots of leakage happens at the time when they start to do internships. Like even if you look at Nazarbayev University is very supportive. Girls in general are very liberated, and faculty are also supportive. But that's only the ideal reality of Nazarbayev universities. Once these girls from STEM fields enter the field and try to gain practice, they start to hear very rigid, severe, discouraging discourses from the employing organizations, which are mostly male-dominated. They hear comments like, you know, there were stories when a girl would wear boots and there would be mud, and the guys will make fun of her and say, like, how come you're not wearing heels? Like, you know, and so when many women drop out or change majors after the first experiences with the employment, then those who persist and continue to employment, by the time they get out of the university, they also enter childbearing age. And suddenly the same parents who encourage them to pursue education, because education adds to their human capital and consequently adds to their potential family capital and increases their dowry value and the possibilities in the marriage market. But as has been mentioned, if you have too much education, if you have a PhD degree and your husband doesn't, that suddenly decreases your value. So the same very parents who were encouraging girls to gain education suddenly become aware that it's time for her to get married, and the fact that she's overly educated and she's going into this male-dominated field actually reduces your chances for getting married. And they start to discourage her, and many women who are still interested in doing science may go into STEM-related fields. So they, instead of working at plants, factories, and mines, they would go into labs or they work as faculty members. And that explains why there are actually lots of female faculty members in STEM fields, because they cannot transition to the industry. So these are some of the insights from our research on STEM pipeline.
Well, thank you so much again for the three speakers. And I know, Aliya, you are already after midnight there. And thank you so much for staying with us until this time. And thank you so much for the participants. I think this is really important. We are in a different culture, but we could connect a lot of things to our own culture. So I think it provides. Noreen, would you like to speak?
There
Yes,
was
please.
A question on men's role, which I think was important, and I'll just briefly
sure, please
touch upon. And it's you know, given the immense importance of motherhood in this context, the role of women is very important in changing men's response to these norms. Almira's recent PhD data we are analyzing, and this girl is saying, my mother-in-law has a remote through which she controls my husband. And yet another one is saying, my husband is supportive because his mother keeps telling him that it's important for him to support me. So I think, you know, these gender norms, although they look like they are static, they are changing, as Aliya's study indicated, all the time, even though this hierarchy remains. But the specific norms change over time. Men are also regulated, so they have to ensure that these roles and these power relations are maintained. But yet there are ways where both individual men and women can transgress these norms. But specifically for gender equality, I think it's the role of mothers are so important in the way they raise both their daughters and their mothers for a world where gender equality becomes possible.
Well, thank you so much, Naureen, for the final comment. Well, thank you, everybody. And then the book, let's read the book in more detailed manner. And then the book is available in online. So I strongly encourage everybody to read the book and get more information. Thank you again for the speakers. Our next seminar will be April 14th, 4 p.m. Thank you, Monique, for posting the next seminar information. So you are all welcome to join for our next seminar. Thank you, everybody, and see you in the next seminar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.